My name is Rusty Coleman. I'm 60 years old, and I live in South Hardin County, Tennessee, on the Tennessee River, off of 43,000 acres on Lake Pickwick, which covers 3 states. Since November of 2015 to this day, I have experienced numerous encounters with Dogman, and I think in part it's because of my genetic code. You can really sense Dogman in my area, way before you get a confirmation by visual means. I think it's ironic that everyone else can't tell a change in the atmosphere of their local area when a Dogman is lurking about. They have killed everything from area pets that are left unattended outside, to livestock that have gone missing on many farms in the area, to flocks of lake geese being torn up and their vital organs ripped out. There are lots of posters around here of missing pets. Most of my Dogman encounters occur mainly at night, or late in the afternoon, or very early in the morning. Back on November 15th, 2015, I heard a loud rustling sound in the leaves across the street in the vacant lot. This was my very first experience with a screaming Dogman, although I had no visual contact with it. It was 5:15 a.m., and due to it being the darkest before dawn, I wasn't able to see anything. But those screams were extremely loud, and due to the pitch of the screams, it had to be standing on 2 legs. It walked 4/10 of a mile down my street, and not one dog barked, nor made any sounds during this. It walked all the way down the road, and crossed over to the next one. On February 7th, about 8 p.m., with my bedroom window cracked open about 2 inches from the top, I heard the howls again, and they went on for several minutes. The howls could be heard over the roar of 3 fans turned on high. That's how loud they were. Then I heard the high-pitched yelps and screams that lasted for another 10 minutes, before everything went as silent as a cemetery. I believe that they were talking to each other that night. Later in the month, I heard what sounded like a massacre outside of my open bedroom window. I heard the screams and yelps of smaller dogs being eaten alive. When I looked outside, I realized there were several of these creatures approaching my window, but they were covered by the darkness of the night, so I didn't get a good visual on them. That north side of my house is too dark, as the nearest street light is over 100 yards away. But the howls and screams were again heard over the 3 fans in my room running on high speeds. It was then that I realized that there was a rapidly unfolding event happening right before me. It was like God spared my life by providing those small dogs to be the sacrifice instead of me. From the sound of it, I would say it was 3 or 4 small dogs being killed. And the next morning, I saw bloody trails leading towards the rear section of my street. After that, I heard more reports of missing pets. March 10th around 2 a.m., I had just drifted off to sleep and heard something on the roof of my house, crawling around right above my head. And then I heard the loudest slam ever. At first, I thought it was my 84-year-old parents falling near the bathroom. But then came the strangest smell. It was a pungent odor of wet dog. I smelled it from my open bedroom window, which I keep open year-round due to having lung issues. The Dogman had been on the top of my roof and leapt down onto my deck. It tore up the section of lattice work underneath the deck too. The next AM, I saw where the ground was torn up and saw very unusual tracks. This May and June, I witnessed Dogman up in a tree. It was perched about 25, maybe 45 feet up in the tree, and about 50 feet away from my house. And it was staring right inside of my house. Staring at me. This is the time when I got a good visual on it. Finally. On May 18th, I was cleaning inside of my residence, and looked up from my window that faces the south. About 45 yards out, and 45 feet up in a tree, this Dogman was just perched up there. It was completely sealed until several gusts of wind lifted the limb, exposing its facial features. I only saw its face briefly, but I'll never forget it. It was gray and white, and its body was wrapped around the backside of the tree. Its presence startled me. It scared me. I was in a trance. I got up off the couch, soaked my head under cold water, and grabbed an ice-cold Diet Pepsi, and laid on the couch. I realized the dogman was still there though, and its eyes were fixed right onto me. So I vacated that room for another. The time of this sighting was 2:35 p.m. Then again on June 5th at 6:15 p.m., I saw a dogman about 50 feet from my deck. He was about 25 feet up in the tree again, and was once again staring directly at me. I was outside on my deck as a storm was in progress. Before I saw the dogman, there were crows out there, pitching a screaming fit. But then all of a sudden, everything in the atmosphere went eerily cemetery silent. That's when I smelled the pungent odor of wet dog and raw sewage again. These two different encounters rattled me good. In July of 2016, I went to sleep in the downstairs garden room, as my upstairs bedroom air conditioner had ceased to work. I went outside at 3:30 a.m. onto the rear deck to urinate, and the summer nature sounds were at its peak. Then when I went out again at 4:15, it was dead quiet. Zero noise. Off in the distance, I heard those wild howls and screams again. I estimated the distance to be less than 2 miles away. I immediately went back inside and back upstairs, even though it was hot. I just felt safer up there. Last Sunday, August 27th, 2017, I saw Dogman twice on my property. First at 4 p.m., between my carport and the thick wild hydrangea foliage, about 40 feet from me. I saw it from shoulder to tail. Its coat had an unusual appearance though. It resembled to me what looked like the embedded beads of a Spalding basketball, and was yellowish lime in color. It blended in with the thick foliage perfectly. With the second encounter, I was standing on my deck, and it ran right under me, about 15 feet below me. I saw the huge creature go directly under me, and saw the shadows of it bounce off the basement light inside. This was about 8 p.m. It was thick and shaggy, and the smell was like something died, like it had been rotting in the sun for days. Both of these encounters scared me so bad, I took a strong medication dosage, and was unconscious until 8 a.m. Monday morning. My opinion on why I'm being sought after by these dogmen lies within my genetic code. My doctor diagnosed it by a blood test in May of 2000. I have a very unique and unusual genetic code. 1 in 50,000. I have both 47XXY and 48XXYY chromosomes. Now I believe that's why Dogman seems to be lurking around me and my locale. I think I've attracted it because it's interested in me, which I don't like. I try my best to avoid and stay clear of this cryptid. My name is Tony McKinnon. My encounter with a dogman happened last July near Lena Lake in Washington. I was with my nephew Justin. I helped raise Justin. His dad, who was my brother, wasn't in the picture, so I helped his mother raise him. He was already a grown man by the time of this encounter, and I was 47 years old. The two of us loved to hike and be outdoors whenever we could. We've been hiking around Lena Lake more times than I can count, and until that day, we never had any bad experience. I've heard a couple stories about Bigfoot, but I always shrug them off as just crap. So anyways, Justin and I were out on one of our hikes, and we came up to this really big boulder that looked like it was easy to climb. So I told Justin, I bet I can beat you to the top, and we started to climb it. For the record, and because I know you're going to listen to this, Justin, I would have beat you if I didn't step on that loose rock. So Justin made it to the top first, but only by a second or two, and then we looked out at the woods. That's what we would normally do on our hikes. Climb up somewhere where we could get a good view of the scenery, and then relax with our lunches. Usually, the forest is noisy. All the animals, birds, and bugs have no problem letting you know that they're out there. And it had been noisy until now. That was the first thing I noticed. and probably why the noise of something running towards us was so loud and clear. It sounded like something big was coming at us. At first, I worried it was a bear. We've seen them out there before, and usually they leave you alone. But if it was running towards us, there was a good chance it would come closer than I was comfortable with. To my relief, though, an elk burst out of the trees. It kept running, though, like the devil was chasing it, and we watched it run off. Then something else came out of the trees. It was huge and hairy. I thought to myself, I'll be damned, Bigfoot is real. But then I noticed something that shouldn't be on it. A wolf snout. This didn't look like a Bigfoot at all, and it was close enough to see everything. Only the boulder was between us, and we were only up about 20 feet. It stood there panting, looking in the direction that the elk ran off. It actually looked pissed off that the elk got away, like it was capable of some kind of human emotion. I grabbed Justin by his shirt and put my finger to his lips. He nodded. This thing was seriously messed up, like it was in a war with something just as big as it. I'll get to the wounds that I saw in a minute, but first I want to describe what it looked like. It had to be 8 feet tall, no problem. It had very big, muscular shoulders, light brown fur, and it looked like a giant wolf, to be honest. A long dog nose, and big ears, not like what people describe a Bigfoot as having. And the legs looked like a dog. You know, the way they bend backwards. They didn't bend forwards like a human, or a primate. It had no tail, or smell that I could smell, but its eyes were yellow. Now to the wounds. The first thing I noticed about this animal, besides the fact that he was a wolf man, was that it was missing his right arm from the elbow down. It looked like he'd been in some serious tussles, and the wound wasn't new. In fact, you can see an area of dark flesh at the end of the nub. It was definitely an old wound. His hair was splotchy in some places, and you can see scars in those bald patches where the hair wouldn't grow anymore. And he also had this sickening scar on the side of his face, like something had bitten him there. In my mind, I was thinking, if there's something out there that can mess this thing up, I definitely don't want to run into it. The two of us stared at this thing, like idiots, not sure what to do. We were completely exposed and out in the open, standing on this boulder like a lunch on a tray. The fear I felt right then and there was paralyzing. I could hear Justin's quickening breath, too, and I glanced over at him. The poor kid looked just as scared as I was. I thought about running. I thought about dragging Justin away and trying to outrun it. I thought about telling Justin to run by himself and using myself as bait. I thought about my wife, our daughter, my sister-in-law, even my worthless brother. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to them yet. Then this thing either finally realized we were there, or finally decided to pay attention to us. It turned its head to us and sniffed the air. At this moment, I realized absolute fear. My body was shaking, and I couldn't do anything to control it. I felt cold. I felt dizzy. I felt nauseous. As we stared at this thing, I told Justin to run. I told him if it comes up here, you get the hell out of these woods. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm not leaving you, man." As absolutely terrified as I was in this moment, it was also the proudest I've ever been of that kid. In that one sentence, I found the strength that I needed. I was ready to fight this thing, even if it killed me in the process. But by the grace of God, this thing just stared at us for a minute before it lifted its lips in a snarl, and then it turned around and quietly walked back into the bushes. After that, pure adrenaline kicked in, and we got the hell out of there. I don't remember much about getting out of there, which is weird to me. I can remember everything about the encounter, but nothing about getting out of the woods. Maybe it was just too much to absorb. Who knows? What I do know is I never go out there anymore. In fact, I try not to go into the forest at all. But if I do, I'm armed. Not that I think any kind of gun would stop this thing, but at least it might slow it down, or distract it enough to get me the hell out of there. What do you think it is that tore this thing up like that? Another one of them? Or a Bigfoot? I'd hate to see the wounds the other thing got. After that day, I started doing a lot of research and found that Dogman and Bigfoot are known to fight each other if the situation is right. Do you think it was over territory? Or food? Or one of them protecting its young from the other? Do you think they run in packs, and maybe it fought a member of a different pack? I shudder to think about multiple dogmen running around in the same area. Do you think maybe it was fighting another one to be the alpha? I really think the reason that it lost that elk was because it had to run on its back legs. I don't think it could run on all fours, especially because one of the arms were gone. I think that if it did try to run like that, it would just slow it down. But I also think that running on two legs makes it slow too. I wonder what it eats instead of elk now. Maybe that's why there's missing persons. I'm so thankful to God that it just walked back into the woods without attacking us. You see it all the time on the Discovery Channel, where an injured or an old carnivore becomes a man-eater because it can't hunt its normal food. Maybe it's because there were two of us, and it didn't want to take both of us on and risk being injured more. I'll probably never know the answer to the questions I have, but it helps share the story and makes me feel better about the encounter. Thank you, Tony.
It's taken a long time to finally identify what exactly that creature was that charged me all those years ago in that small park in southern Indiana. You see, it happened back in the Dark Ages, in the summer of 1993. The internet was unheard of. Home computers were very rare. Phones were still for houses, and UB40 was tearing up the airwaves with their rendition of Elvis Presley's classic, I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. I was 16 that summer. It was one of those summers I'll never forget. A lot happened to me that summer. From riding around in a stolen car, moving away from all of my friends, and even learning how to play chess. It was a summer to remember, for sure. Still though, after all these years, the one event that stands out over all the rest was the night I came face to face with what I call Piggly Wiggly. I'm now 41, and that sighting has changed the way that I look at the world and nature, but especially the way that I think about the supernatural. I didn't know much about cryptids at that time. Like I said, no internet. I had of course heard of Bigfoot and thought it was a myth, or perhaps a case of mistaken identity. I'd seen werewolf movies, of course, but at that time thought they were nothing more than folklore and Hollywood nonsense. I thought they were made up to scare people in the days of the Salem witch hunts, or to keep children close to their homes at night. I don't believe like that anymore. I can't. I have been forever changed by what I encountered that summer night. I was never much of a stoner. Pot always had effects on me that I deemed less than enjoyable. First, it always made me very, very paranoid. Second, it made me very hungry. And lastly, very sleepy. Despite never really enjoying it, I would partake from time to time with friends, just in the spirit of going along to get along. Such was the case the first time Piggly Wiggly ever entered my reality. Jeremy was new to the apartment complex, but he and I hit it off right away. He also got along with my very best friend Charlie. Jeremy had a very troubled home life, and his mother was a very avid pot smoker. Thus, he had access to it pretty much all the time. One day, he invited Charlie and me to go out into the woods with him, behind the apartments, so we could smoke a little. I say the woods in quotations, as they're not really what I think of when I think of woods. Not the kind of area you would expect to experience nature, or anything like that at all. It was just a bunch of trees for maybe 2 or 3 football fields in length, and as wide as 2 or 3 football fields as well. It had basically one trail that led from the apartments to a little park where we used to go play basketball. Apart from that, it had a creek bed that ran adjacent to the trail on the south side, with maybe another 50 to 100 yards of woods as far as the side of the creek. And then it was just houses. Lots of houses. So, like I said, not a place you would expect to encounter nature. I had lived with my dad in West Virginia for several years and had hiked up in the real woods and encountered real nature. We even had a face-to-face encounter with a bear once on an afternoon hike in a West Virginia state park. At that time, I doubted if these little woods even had deer. I'd seen squirrels, of course, but that's all I figured lived in that tiny section of woods. One important thing to note, however, is that on the north side of the woods was a park, and it had a fenced-in rock quarry. Anyone who has ever studied deep underground military bases might find this fact interesting. I don't know if this quarry was linked to any of those supposed underground secret bases, but it's just an interesting side note. Anyways, as I was saying, the three of us walked back into the woods to find a safe place to smoke. We got far enough off the trail where we felt secure, and actually came all the way to the creek. We decided this was secluded enough to smoke a little. We took turns hitting the joint, and as one of us would smoke, the other two would kind of face away from the creek, just watching towards the trail to make sure that nobody was heading our way. I had hit it 2 or 3 times already, and felt that first wave of paranoia start to creep in. I was thinking, I sure hope the FBI aren't out here on patrol. Now, I know, the thought of FBI agents in a tiny wooded section of a local neighborhood park is absurd, but remember, pot always made me stupid paranoid. The thought was still in my head when I heard the sounds for the first time. They were from the other side of the creek. I heard footsteps running in a mad dash, running down the creek bed, splashing through the shallow water. I knew that all that was left for the runner to do was come up to the creek bed that was on our side of the creek, exactly where Charlie was standing and smoking the joint. Jeremy and I were facing the other way, but we both heard the splashing water, and I think most of southern Indiana must have heard Charlie when he screamed, "Run!" We darted off through the woods and back towards the trail. I had this visual image in my head as I darted off, of 2 men with blue windbreakers and ball caps with the letters FBI on them, hot on our trail. I ran even faster, not sure exactly where Charlie and Jeremy were in relation to me. I could hear them, but I was running so hard that my eyes had started to tear up, and mixed with the buzz from the THC, it was as if I was running through a tunnel, and everything in my peripheral vision was darkened. I just kept listening for my friends' footsteps, and adjusting my direction towards them. As I was running, I ran right through a giant spider web. You see, this park was full of these nasty spider webs that year. They were huge, perfectly circular, and made these large, nasty webs that were made by even larger and nastier black and yellow spiders. They were creepy, and I hate spiders. I realized I now had a thick web all over my head and stuck to my face, while still running full speed through the woods. If that wasn't bad enough, it got even worse. As I was wiping off the web from my face and out of my hair, one of those ugly spiders came dangling from my head and was swinging right in front of my face. I never touch bugs, especially spiders. I hate them with a passion. Still, without thinking about it, I swatted that ugly mother away from me, and the momentum made him sail through the air, but only right back into my face. About 90 seconds after the initial call to run, all 3 of us made it out of the woods, past the park, and into the neighborhood. Charlie had made it there first. I was last. I finally got rid of that spider, though. I saw Charlie slow down and begin to walk, and since he was the one who knew what was going on, I figured it was safe to stop running too. I looked at my friend and asked with full sincerity, "Was it the FBI?" "What?" "No," Charlie hesitantly said. "It was a monster." I laughed right away. Oh my goodness. Here I thought I was being chased by authorities, and it was one of my best friend's imaginations that caused us to run. His face was pale. He was shaking. And although I knew he was not joking, I couldn't help but tease him. "Yeah, right, like a Piggly Wiggly monster?" I don't know why I said that. I guess I'd seen a Piggly Wiggly grocery store once or twice in my lifetime, and that's why it came out of my mouth. I'll never know. Still, the name stuck, and all these years later, the creature is still called that by my old friends and myself. I could tell Charlie didn't want to talk about it, but I couldn't let it go. We took the long way back to my apartment, navigating through the neighborhood streets and staying away from the woods. The whole way back, I kept pressing him to talk to me, but he was very reluctant to speak. I was never known to go easy on my friends when they said or did something foolish, so I could understand why he didn't want to open up. He knew I didn't believe him already, and I had teased him when he first said it was a monster. But his behavior made me think it was more than just that, though. It seemed almost as if he was hiding something from me. Charlie and I didn't hide anything from each other, especially in those days. We were closer than brothers. We knew everything about one another. Or, so I thought, I guess. When we got back to my place, Charlie said there was something he wanted to tell us. He said it's something he was sworn to secrecy about, and that's why he had never told me. By this time, my buzz was gone, and if the chase didn't sober me up, this completely surprising revelation that Charlie had a secret that he never shared with me was plenty enough to do the trick. The next part of this story is what happened to Charlie about 3 years prior to that day. He says he was camping with some friends in those woods very near to that park. If I remember correctly, there were about 6 of them in the tent that night. 2 of the boys were brothers that I met when I first moved into the apartments, but they moved very shortly after I got there. Besides the brothers and Charlie, I don't remember who else he said was there that night. It was dark, and the boys were in their tent telling stories and just doing what teenage campers do. He said they kept hearing a rustling sound, maybe 30 to 60 feet away from in some taller bush. They tried to ignore it at first, but it just wouldn't stop. A couple of the boys decided to take some flashlights and check it out. 2 of the boys walked out into the brush where the sound was coming from and shined their lights at the thing moving around. In horror, they both turned towards the tent where the other campers were watching with their heads sticking out of the zipper and yelled for everybody to run. At that point, this monster came charging at the boys. He headed straight towards the tent, and it was a mad scramble as the boys tried to get out of the tent and away from this beast. They left the tent and all their gear there, obviously. They all made it out safely and retreated to the apartment of the 2 brothers, where they all stayed for the rest of the night. They told their dad, who happened to be a police officer. He took their story seriously enough that he took another officer with him the next day and searched in the woods. From what Charlie told me, he said the brothers told him that their dad searched and searched the woods and found what appeared to be a homeless man sleeping near a creek bed near the quarry. This would have had to have been a different creek than the one that we were at that day, as the creek and the quarry were on opposite sides of the trail. I'm guessing this was beyond the no trespassing fence line that belongs to the quarry. The sleeping man woke up and saw the officers and ran. That's all he was told happened that day. But after that, the boy's dad called all the boys and warned them to never speak of this to anyone ever again. Then, the dad took the boys and moved away. This part I can confirm. The family did move away suddenly, right after I moved in. I sat there, taking all of this in. Charlie was not lying. He may have been completely wrong about what happened, as I was pretty sure he was. But what he was saying, he sincerely believed happened to him. I didn't believe there was a monster living in those shallow woods, not for a second. But still, the thought of it being true excited me. I had to know. I had to find out for myself. I decided we had to go out and find out. Jeremy was more of a skeptic than even I was, but he was all for the monster hunt as well. Charlie was very, very much against it, though. It took a lot for me to convince him. I used the old reverse psychology trick saying, well, no one will believe you unless we see it for ourselves. And eventually, something I said finally got through to him, and he agreed to go with us. I came up with a plan to find the Piggly Wiggly monster. I would take some stakes out of my freezer and tie them to a tree about 3/4 of the way to the park along the trail. Then we would take some flashlights after dark and walk along the trail until we arrived at the park to see if this thing was real or not. We would stop along the way and see if the stakes were still hanging on the tree, or perhaps catch this supposed beast in the act of eating them. We went and enlisted 2 other friends of ours to join the search party. I told them my plan, and took one with me to verify that I set up the bait. I didn't want to be accused of rigging the outcome. We walked about 3/4 of the way to the park, and then I found a tree that would be an easy spot at night, and I climbed about 10 feet from the ground. I didn't want it to be low enough for a dog to get to it. I tied it up and we walked back. I have to say, I was growing very excited for this adventure. I spent the rest of the day telling other friends what we were doing and trying to get them to come along. In the end, though, only the original 5 said yes. That night, when it got dark, we met at my house. We only had 2 flashlights, and Charlie brought a small baseball bat. We went over the plans again. I told them we would walk the whole trail to the park, and on the way out, we would check the bait. We stored it towards the woods, and we could just barely see the trail when one of the boys, who agreed to come Piggly Wiggly hunting, got cold feet and said, "I have to go home and take a dump." Of course, I used this to tease him of being a scaredy cat. Honestly, though, I couldn't remember how anyone would want to miss out on this fun. So now we were 4. As we approached the woods, I was surprised to see how timid Jeremy had become. He believed in this story less than any of us, yet I could sense a little fear oozing from him. I wasn't afraid at all, and decided to take the lead position. Besides, I was the one that hung the stakes, and would know when we got to that tree. It was dark on that trail. The treetops covered any light the moon could have supplied. It still seemed fun to me as we began down that trail towards the park. I knew everyone behind me was a little scared, but honestly, I don't think I was. Not yet, anyways. I'd spent so much time in much deeper woods, often by myself, and this to me was not really the woods at all, so there was nothing for me to be afraid of. Besides, I kept telling myself, nothing could live in this tiny wooded area. However, out of respect for Charlie, who I knew didn't want to be there, I decided not to clown around and try to scare the others. We were only about 1/4 of the way to the park when those sounds started. It sounded like something came from the direction we were headed to. I swear, it sounded like someone or something was breaking sticks. Snap, snap, and then nothing for a few minutes. And then snap, snap, snap. I had to admit that that was weird, but in my mind, only a human would be doing that. Why would a Piggly Wiggly monster be breaking sticks? Then again, why would a person be at the park at night breaking sticks either? It made no sense to me either way. As we progressed, the sound was louder and louder as we got closer to the park, and I did start to get that creepy feeling in my stomach. Because the others too were getting creeped out by the sounds as well, a mutiny was about to begin. The other guys were talking about going back. I kept trying to press them by saying, "Just a little further to the tree, guys. We have to see if the stake is still up there." I used all the power of persuasion that I had acquired in my 16 years on Earth. I didn't want to turn back yet, and by now, I was a little creeped out too, and I definitely didn't want to go the rest of the way by myself. After what seemed like it took 3 times the normal amount of time, we finally arrived at that tree. I took a flashlight and began to search for my stakes. By this time, the cracking of sticks had stopped, and it was very quiet all around us. Too quiet all around us. I waved my flashlight to and fro and back and forth. Nothing. The stakes were gone. Admittedly, now I was very creeped out. What in these woods could climb a tree? What in these woods would even eat a steak? I felt fear begin to grow in my bosom. I did not want to let it show, though. I said, "Let's get out of here," in the most calm voice that I could muster at that moment. I was the leader, and I decided we were closer to the park than the apartments. The park had lights on the far end and houses just past it. I wanted so badly to be in that neighborhood by this time. Besides, we'd not heard the breaking stick sounds from the park for several minutes. I didn't run. I didn't want to spook the others, but I did pick up the pace tremendously, and nobody there complained about that. The 4th kid that joined was whimpering a little the rest of the way, which actually made me more afraid. I kept thinking to myself, what have I gotten us into? Then we came to the end of the trail and out of the woods. I was relieved. Not too far off the street were there lights and all the houses. We kept on walking right through the park, and that's when I saw it. Piggly Wiggly. Or more accurately, something that looked a lot like a werewolf. It was standing just outside the moonlight in the shadows of a park picnic shelter. It was far enough away that I couldn't get a great bit of detail, but close enough to know it wasn't human. It was standing on two legs, a little hunched over, hairy, with long, strong arms, and maybe 6 foot tall when standing erect. At first, I thought it was my imagination. It had to be my imagination playing tricks on me. It's hard to describe what you think when your natural mind comes into contact with the supernatural. It's confusing and overwhelming, and very real, and yet unbelievable all at once. It feels very similar to being in a dream. The boy behind me who had been whimpering stopped walking as well. I could tell he too was seeing what I was seeing. And then Charlie spotted the figure. All this seemed like minutes, but was actually only seconds. The creature was definitely staring at us. Then he stood up, and now seeing it shift position, I knew it was not my imagination anymore. We took off and sprinted to the house line just outside the park. When this thing stood up, it was well over 6 feet tall. We were gasping in disbelief. When we stopped, we were talking over one another about what we just saw. You see, when Charlie told us the story, he never told us what it looked like. What the heck was that thing? We kept asking over each other. A monkey? A Bigfoot? A werewolf? We were all teared up and in shock. Well, all of us except Jeremy. Because you see, he was the last in our single file line, and by the time he reached the end of the woods where we had all spotted the Piggly Wiggly, the 3 of us had already taken off running. He hadn't seen anything, but not wanting to be left alone, he ran with us. Still afraid, but now annoyed, I thought to myself, great. Without Jeremy, the most skeptical of all of us, to collaborate this story, we might as well have not even seen this thing at all. Without Jeremy believing us, this whole expedition was fruitless. I had to make him believe, and the only way for me to do that was to show him this creature myself. The other 2 boys refused to take one step closer to the park. They were much wiser than I was. I walked back about 200 feet or so with Jeremy. I stayed within the light of the street lamp that lit up the driveway of the park. I felt for some reason that being in the light we were safe. I have no idea why I thought that. We could see the picnic shelters fine from there, but I didn't see the monster at all. He was gone. I was bummed that the monster was no longer standing where he was before. I thought, great, now he's gonna think we're all crazy, just like how I thought Charlie was all day. That serves me right, I guess. I sighed very heavily in defeat and said to him, "He was right over there, man, I swear." I pointed to the dark shelter. But as I turned to where Jeremy had been standing, I noticed I was all alone. Jeremy was gone. I thought to myself, what the hell is that all about? As I straightened my head back to its natural position, I saw Piggly Wiggly charging at me full speed. He was already within the light of the street lamp, and now I had a perfect view of this freak from less than 20 feet away. It had a long muzzle like a wolf. It was covered in brown fur with some grays mixed in. Around its head was even longer hair, almost like a lion's mane. It was very muscular, and when it ran, it would touch its arms like an ape to the ground for stability. Its face was canine, not quite like a wolf, but definitely a dog. I took all this in as I breathed in a very tight and shallow breath. My mind was processing information at a rapid pace as fight or flight kicked in. I sure as hell had no intentions of fighting. I turned and ran faster than I ever had or ever have since. I even passed Jeremy, who had spotted the beast before me and failed to say anything to me before fleeing. Some people might think that was a turd-headed move, as I did at that time. Later, though, he admitted to me he tried to yell, but in fear, nothing came out of his mouth. He had seen this thing as it approached us before it came into the light. He didn't get a great detail, but he saw enough to satisfy his skeptical mind. He knew he was looking at a bipedal dog creature. He would later describe it as a dog bear, looking like an ape when it ran. We finally made it back home safely. I took my dog to the park the next day. She was going nuts. I let her go and she kept barking at a tree that had fallen. I inspected the tree and noticed a bunch of broken sticks beside it. I immediately thought of the sounds from the night before, and then I noticed something else. It was inside a hollow tree. Bones. Lots of small animal bones. I don't know if they were local dogs or squirrels or what. I don't know, and I didn't bother to find out. I've never hunted the Piggly Wiggly monster again after that. Now, thanks to the internet and the collective hive mindset, I'm fairly certain that what almost caught me all those years ago was a dogman. Probably the type 3 variation. It wasn't a bear or a lion. It wasn't a Sasquatch. It wasn't an ape or a werewolf. Yes, it had characteristics of all of these, but it was very much canine. It was a dogman. I like to camp and I like to hike in the woods, but now I never go alone. More than that, I never ever ever go into the woods after dark. You never know what's watching you.
My encounter happened in 2008, in the state of Mississippi. Where I live, there's this little levee. It's nothing big, and it's nothing special. But it's special to me. I like to spend a lot of time out there. And depending on my mood, that reflects just how much time I'm out there. If I'm really pissed off, I'll run as fast as I can, as far as I can, for as long as I can. I'll run like the devil's chasing me. And believe me, after my encounter, when I felt it was safe enough to run, I really did run like the devil was chasing me. But other times when I'm out there, I like to relax. I like to take it easy and just walk for hours. I'll walk for miles, and then I'll turn around and walk back, just listening to nature, enjoying her company. Sometimes I'll sit by the little portion of the river that this levee flows through, and I'll just watch the current. On one side, there's this slope. It's not a steep slope, but it's more of an embankment, and it stretches probably 100 feet or so. There's grass and bushes, and then there's the river. On the top of the levee itself, it's mostly gravel and more bushes. And believe me, those bushes are a lifesaver. I'll tell you more about that as my story goes on. Occasionally, though, on the top of that levee, one asshole or another dumps his trash, and I'll do my best to keep it clean. On the other side of the levee, there's another embankment, but this one probably only goes about 30 feet. And then there's this huge field with a marsh and a pond. After that, it's just miles and miles of forest. Like I said, I've been out there probably 1.5 million times, and never have I ever experienced something as unnatural and unexplainable as what I'm about to share with you. The night of my encounter, I had already been out there about 15 minutes. I was taking one of my leisurely strolls this time, just clearing my mind from a tough day at work, listening to some music on my iPod, and up ahead of me, I see these two gigantic dogs running on the side that's closest to the river. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Sometimes there are dogs out there. Sometimes they get away from their owner, and you see a frantic person running by after the dog jets by you, looking for their dog and calling their name. But this night, there was just something
different about these two dogs that were in front of me? For starters, they were huge. Now, I'll be the first person to admit, I don't know squat about dogs. I don't know what dog breed is what, unless it's a pit bull or a Great Dane or a collie. I could tell those. But these things that were ahead of me, I had no idea what they were. But they were still far enough away from me to where I wasn't very intimidated. But I do admit, I slowed down my pace, just to be on the safe side. But what I want to stress to you is how taken aback I was from the size of these things. Even knowing as little as I did about dogs, these things just seemed way too big to be dogs. And I knew they for sure weren't wolves, because there's definitely not wolves around here. As they were running by the river, one of them took a quick turn and came up onto the path on the levee. At that point, I stopped walking altogether, just to make sure that nothing funny was going to happen. But it didn't even stay on the levee that long. What it did was leap off of the levee onto the other side. That's where the 30-foot embankment was. And it leapt with this unnatural grace. And the length that it cleared was just uncanny. As it landed, the other one that was chasing it, which I might add was also the bigger one, leapt off of this embankment too, with just as much grace, but even more power. Now at first, when they were running, I thought, there's just these two big dogs having fun and chasing each other. But the more I watched them, and the more they reacted to each other, the more I realized there wasn't anything playful about this encounter. This was an act of aggression. To me, as I watched them, it seemed like the larger one was actually chasing the smaller one. Once they got into the field, I could see them better. That's when I realized, even though I think part of me already knew, these weren't dogs at all. They looked like these huge wolves. And like I said, I knew for sure, as hell, that there were no wolves in my area. I've seen a couple red wolves at a zoo once, and they looked about 1,000,000 times bigger than this red wolf. Plus, I know how rare those wolves are. They're not just gonna appear like that, in daylight especially. I mean, what would those odds even be? To see not one, but two endangered species running around chasing each other, jumping to and fro off of a levee, where I've never ever seen them before. Besides the difference in size, they actually looked nothing like the red wolves that I saw at the zoo. For starters, they were both dark brown, and they had really shaggy hair, like a golden retriever, or maybe even longer. They had these long snouts, just like a wolf, and they were really, really big. I know I keep telling you how big these creatures were, but I can't stress enough how big they were. They were probably 4 feet at least when they were on all fours. The heads on these things looked like they were bigger than any dog could ever get. Even at the distance I still was from them, I could still appreciate the size of their heads. And I could also make out the shape of their ears. They were long and triangular. I've looked at different pictures of dog species and wolf species on the internet since I had my encounter. And the closest thing I could find are the ears of a Doberman pinscher. Long and slender, but pointed at the ends. The front paws of these things looked more like hands, but the back paws still resembled paws, and they both had these bushy, long tails. Now, by this time, both of them were already in that field, and they were still running from each other. But they were running extremely fast. Again, I've done research on the internet, and I know the greyhound is the fastest dog in the world. But these things, I'd say they were still faster than that. At this point, I was already terrified. But I chose to watch them. But it was from the safety of behind one of those bushes I told you about earlier. I just didn't want to take the chance of them seeing me. Even as preoccupied with each other as they were, I was still scared that if they saw me, they would both turn their attention towards me, and I'd be dog chow. Or, as I thought that night, werewolf chow. That's when the larger one caught up with the smaller one. It grabbed it by the back left leg with its teeth, and they both tumbled to the ground. I think part of that was because of the momentum they already had, because of the speed that they were going. The smaller one let out this, I don't know, scream? It wasn't like a yelp. Not like a yelp that canines do. But it was this noise. It sounded half between a scream and a yell. Like a mix between a man and an animal. Insert the inkling that these might not be a normal species at this point. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at, but I was still completely captivated by what I was watching, even as terrified as I was. That's when I definitely decided that these two were definitely not playing around. It almost seemed to me like they were gonna fight to the death. They both got back on all fours, and then they started ramming into each other, swiping with their front claws and biting at each other. Now at this point, they were both making that horrible, terrifying scream. I was on the verge of pissing myself, but I knew that if I ran away, I would never stop wondering what happened or what these things were. Then, to my utter disbelief and my utter horror, they both stood up on their back legs and rammed into each other again. Now, when I say they got up, I'm not talking they reared up like a dog can do. These suckers made this stretching movement, and then they stood up like a frigging person would do. Then they started ramming into each other again, and they were ripping at each other with those claws. All I could think while I was watching was I was witnessing a fight between two werewolves. Because in my mind, that's exactly what they were. Because that's exactly what they looked like. They were these two huge wolf-like creatures that were standing on two legs now, and they were fighting each other. They were swatting at each other. They weren't biting like wolves do. They were actually fighting. And I still had absolutely no idea what the hell I was looking at. I remember actually looking up at the sky at that point. I wanted to see if it was a full moon. And I'll admit, I looked up just for a second, because I didn't want to miss anything that I was witnessing, especially if they turned their attention towards me. And not only was the sun still partially up, since it was barely dusk, but there was no full moon. So it couldn't have been werewolves. Could it? Could the myth of the full moon be just that? A myth? I mean, up until this point, if you had told me that werewolves exist, I'd have told you to put down the pipe. But here I was, a grown man, about to become an officer of the law, crouching behind this bush, watching two monsters that aren't supposed to exist not only actually exist, but fight each other. The more these things fought, the bloodier it got. Their fur was starting to clump, and they looked pretty wet. I could just imagine how bloody they must have looked close up, and how much blood was all over the field that they were fighting in. I mean, those claws. God, those claws. They looked like they could swat the head off of a grown man, and they looked like they could do it with ease. But these two were taking hits like a professional MMA fighter, and they were beating the hell out of each other. That's when the larger one got back down on all fours, and it charged at the smaller one again. It rammed right into his midsection and knocked it on its back. After that, I think the smaller one must have submitted. It must have done something like that, because the fighting just stopped. The bigger one looked like it was snarling, and the smaller one looked like there was nothing that it could do. The big one had the small one pinned to the ground, and it let out this roar, or something that's equivalent to a roar in the supernatural world. This roar echoed inside my chest, inside my ears, inside my head. I think I actually felt my chest vibrate. It was just that loud. That's when I decided I needed to get the hell out of there. If they were done beating the shit out of each other, that meant they had time to notice me. And I couldn't take the hits that this thing was taking. Not from those claws. I remember doing this crouching backwards creep for what seemed like forever. I tried my damnedest not to make a single sound. But all the while, I didn't take my eyes off of these things. I watched them as the two of them got back down on all fours and stood there, just staring at each other. That's when I could really see the size difference. The smaller one looked like it weighed 50, maybe even 100 pounds less than the other one. I could see them both panting. Their chest was going up and down quickly, and these tongues were sticking out of them. Thick, long, pink tongues. I think I even saw the larger one urinate on the smaller one, or at least urinate next to the smaller one. I think it was an act of dominance. Once I felt I was far enough away, I ran all the way home. And like I said earlier, I ran like the devil was chasing me. When I got home, I locked my door. I poured myself a drink. I tried to calm down my nerves, but nothing was helping. I smoked 3 cigarettes inside my house just to try and calm my nerves, when I had a strict no cigarettes in the house policy. But I sure as hell wasn't going outside that night. At that point, I didn't think I'd ever go outside again. I also sat down and wrote everything I could remember. Now, I had absolutely no intentions of talking about this or telling people what I saw, but I knew I needed to write down every possible detail. That way I could never forget anything about what I saw that night. I've never been that scared my entire life. In fact, I've never even been close to that kind of terror. That fear was just overwhelming. I didn't talk about what I saw for the longest time. I was afraid of being ridiculed or being called a liar. Like I said, I was about to become an officer for Fish and Game, and I didn't really need the reputation of being Spooky Mulder or the reputation of being crazy. Now that I've talked about it with other officers that I trust, I'm not the only one that's seen these things, and I'll be getting those stories for you too. I still have a hard time sleeping at night sometimes. Sometimes I have nightmares. After pulling out this encounter for you, I had a few rough nights, but I think I'm doing okay now. My theory is that they were fighting for dominance, or for the pack. I think the big one was the alpha, and the smaller one was challenging him. I don't think that fight went so well for the smaller one. I'm not sure what these creatures are. Werewolves, dogmen, something else. I know they're not any known species, at least in the normal world. In the world that you and all the other narrators live on in YouTube, they're pretty normal. But I think, judging from the amount of encounters, it's safe to consider them as a native species. Who knows how long they've actually been there, lurking in the shadows. Like you said in our emails, maybe the myth of the werewolf was actually based on a sighting of dogmen. I know I definitely thought they were werewolves when I first saw them. And until I talked to you, that's exactly what I thought they were. Until you shed the light on me that these creatures really exist. The only thing that I actually know for certain is the full moon has nothing to do with these creatures. Thank you for relaying my story. I hope that everybody else that's too afraid to share their encounters with dogmen, or any other paranormal creature for that matter, can take comfort in the fact that there are people out there that not only want to relay their stories, but get them into contact with other people who have had similar encounters. So again, Supernaturalist, I thank you, and good night.
Hello. I hope this scary encounter reaches you in good health. It comes all the way from my home in Russia. Me and my brother Ivan found a pair of dogmen 2 years ago in 2015. This letter is going to need to be translated some. I speak English, but it is not my first language. It starts out that we were hiking by the Krasnaya River one day while we were camping out, just the two of us. We used to love to hike because the woods are so beautiful. Ivan had just had a daughter a few months before, and we hadn't been out much together because there was much to do with the new baby. But this weekend his wife said yes to a camping trip for two brothers. As we walked along the river, we talked about my niece, and he asked when I was going to have a family of my own. I laughed because I did not have a girlfriend even, so a baby was not going to happen soon for me. We stopped to eat our lunch and enjoyed the daylight that was glistening on the water. We were there approximately 20 minutes before we had a smoke and relaxed on the shore of the river. That's when my brother sprang to his legs and said, "What is that over on the opposite shore?" He was very scared, and I looked over there fast to see what was wrong. What we saw is still frightening to me this day. Typing this to you is scaring me, just remembering that day. What we saw looked just like a werewolf movie monster. It was standing on the other shore, staring back at us, and it was on two legs. I stood up quickly too and stepped next to my brother to watch in disbelief. I'm almost sure this monster, as it stared back at us, locked eyes with me. When I close my eyes right now typing, I can still see exactly what it looked like. It was dark gray with some black in it, like it was old and once was all black. It had very pointed ears on top of its head and a large wolf muzzle. It looked to me like someone took a head from a German Shepherd dog and put it on a Bigfoot's body, except that the legs were bent backwards like a dog or wolf. It had very long arms that came down to the knee area, but its hands were not like a dog. The hands were like a man's, but they had long fingers and claws. It was very tall and very big. I think it snarled at us, or at least in our direction, and puffed up like a gorilla you see on nature TV shows. Then it howled, but the howl from this beast was not like a wolf howl. It was more like a howl mixed with a scream. It was the scariest noise I have heard in my life. That is when we saw another one pop out of the trees. I wanted to run for my life, but my legs would not listen to me. This one walked towards the shore on two legs too. Ivan and me were in disbelief. Ivan whispered that we had to leave. I nodded, but could still not find my legs.
This second werewolf, or dogman as you call it, was smaller than the gray dogman. I think it was a younger one. Even though it was smaller, it was still huge. I would say that the first one was probably 8 or 9 feet tall. By the way, I used the internet to make the height into feet for you. The second dogman was probably 7.5 feet tall. This dogman was dark brown, but had the same pointed ears on its head like the first one. It also had the backwards dog legs and the long arms with claws on its hands. The gray one lifted his head up and looked like he was sniffing at the air. Then, to the horror of Yvonne and me, they started communicating together. They made these noises like yipping. It sounded most like when a dog is excited to get a treat or see his master. By now, Yvonne was pulling me away and we were stumbling around the rocks, up towards the way we came. That is when the 2 dogmen got down on all 4 of their legs and ran off in 2 different directions. "They're coming for us," Yvonne told me. At this moment, I found my legs and we started running. The dogmen were unbelievably fast. When they are on all 4 of their legs, I believe this is the way they run faster. The way they moved, they could keep up with my car even. "They're trying to cut us off," Yvonne yelled at me while we were huffing and puffing, trying to get back up the slope. We helped each other get up and ran as fast as we could back to where we came from. I have never ran so fast in my life. Neither has Yvonne. We arrived back at our truck and drove fast all the way home. We told Yvonne's wife Lana about the monsters we had seen in the woods, but she did not believe us. She thought we were teasing her. Yvonne swore to her that we were truthful, and she had started to believe us. She told my brother he is never going back to those woods, and he agreed. We still have not returned there to those woods in 2 whole years. This encounter has changed the way we live. We moved closer into the city to be around more people, and we all still live together. We have motion sensing lights on our house, so the nighttime isn't scary for us, and we have bars on our windows. Our neighbors think we have gone insane crazy, but when we tell them what we saw, they either believe us and understand why we do this, or they do not and they laugh at us. I do not care what other people believe or don't. What we witnessed that day was a pair of dogmen.